This is the Master Brewers Podcast, brought to you by the Master Brewers Association of the Americas, a volunteer organization dedicated to continually improving the products and processes of our membership since 1887.
Let's go!
Master Brewers brings you interviews with the industry's best and brightest in brewing science, technology, and operations.
Calm down, I'm moving too fast.
Support for this podcast and the following messages come from our friends at the Paul Mueller Company and Hopsteiner. Please thank them. This podcast wouldn't be possible without their generous support.
Paul Mueller Company has been manufacturing quality brewing equipment since 1964. Our innovative design and engineering will save you time, labor, and ingredients, sending money back to your bottom line. Learn more about our new mobile hop module at paulmueller.com. This Master Brewers podcast is proudly sponsored by Hopsteiner, a global leader in the hop industry focused on quality, sustainability, and innovation in new hop varieties and hop products. Contact our brewery sales team to provide you with the hop-related tools you need to craft your next great beer. For more information, visit hopsteiner.com.
The classic definition no longer is completely valid in North America. And why? It's because we started breeding a new version of Tworow in North America, and it's fairly recent. It's only since the 70s. And we've moved away from the classic definition of Tworow barley. It doesn't really apply.
This week on the show, fan favorite Joe Hertrick explains why most of us are brewing with Tworow barley that was designed for adjunct brewers. The content is awesome, but it's pretty long, so I've chopped it up into multiple parts. First, you'll hear Joe introduce the subject, then the rest of part 1 is a separate segment on the history of barley in North America. In part 2, Joe explains exactly how North American Tworow changed, why it happened, and who benefited from that evolution. Next week, you'll hear part 3, why today's North American Tworow is problematic for all-malt brewers and what you can do about it. Joe, for years we've all been taught that there are two different types of barley in North America, but you've observed some deviations that are potentially problematic for all-malt brewers. I guess before we can talk about what's changed, we probably ought to start at the beginning, right?
Yes, I think so, John, because classic teaching has always been for brewers the differences between Tworow and Sixrow, and it's in literature explanation, and it's passed on from brewer to brewer. We've all learned that Tworow has larger, more uniform kernels with higher extract potential, and that it's typically lower protein and lower in the malt elements that are derived from protein, such as soluble protein and enzymes and the color potential for it. And we've also been taught that Sixrow has more soluble protein and enzyme, and it's really good for adjunct brewing. In fact, in some cases, it's just mandatory for adjunct brewing. And these Sixrow elements simply derive from there's just more crowded, smaller kernels on the barley head. So the premise of this podcast is that the classic definition no longer is completely valid in North America. And why? It's because we started breeding a new version of Tworow in North America, and it's fairly recent. It's only since the 70s. And we've moved away from the classic definition of Tworow barley. It doesn't really apply in North America. So I thought it would have some value to go through this. I've been in brewing since 1965, so I watched this transition from historic varieties in the United States through the new bred in North America varieties. And also, I was fortunate enough to be a member of AMBA for 3 different companies since its founding. So I was present and looked at the approval processes of how we got here. And I will be the first to admit my view back of the approval processes now is with perfect 2020 hindsight. But I thought it would be valuable to document this as an exercise, if no other goal than to let's make sure we teach new brewers these differences in barley varieties.
Very good. Now, you mentioned that breeding Tworow didn't really start at all in North America until the 70s. Why
Right.
is that?
I think it's because of low interest in Tworow. You know, we were a six-row country from adaptation for 350 years. As recently as the 50s and 60s, probably only 10% of the malt in the United States was Tworow. So there wasn't that much interest. This is long before craft brewing. This is long before all-malt brewing.
Coming up.
This is another myth about Sixrow, that it was in the U.S. and became popular only because of adjunct brewing. That's not true. We brewed for 250 years, ale tradition, before lager and before adjuncts, with only Sixrow.
All right, up next is that history segment, which I think is awesome, but feel free to skip to the next part if you're already a barley history expert.
I think what I'll do is I'll touch on some history of how we got to that start in 1972.
Sounds good.
First of all, let's hit some ancient barley history. You know, barley is ancient, long standing, of tens of thousands of years. If it's not the first cereal cultivated, it's one of the first cereal cultivated, and its origins appear to be in what we now think of modern Syria, Israel, and Jordan. And at that time, both Tworow and Sixrow were present, and it's really not even clear how which one preceded the other. It's not really clear whether Sixrow preceded Tworow or Tworow preceded Sixrow back in this ancient period. And it's interesting because we run into the same problem that we run into when we try to search for the origins of beer. We have the same problem with barley because there were no written languages till about 3500 BC. And all this happening in barley, the cultivation of it at 8000 BC, the collection of wild barley in 19,000 BC, all this was going on well before there was any recorded history. And one point I'd make, it's a myth that Sixrow is a modern invention just for adjunct brewing. It's very ancient. And out there in the world, the germplasm collection that exists for barley now has about 4,300 varieties in it. About half of them are Tworow and half of them are Sixrow. So it's been around for a long time. It had to be adapted, though, because it's native in origins in the Middle East. So with the knowledge of beer, when people moved, they took barley with them. They never left home without it. And through the spread of civilization, barley went everywhere and was adapted across the globe as they moved. And it's now actually considered the most widely adapted cereal in the world. It's grown at elevation. It's grown up in the Arctic Circle. It's very drought tolerant. Every location that has a cultivated crop on the whole globe has barley. It's a cool season crop, and it's adapted differently in different places. So we know that it's not native to North America. It had to be brought here by settlers and explorers. And we know that it didn't really get brought here for food. It got brought here for animal feed and for brewing. The settlement of whether barley should be used for food or not was made in medieval times, long before anybody came to the United States or North America, because the elastic properties of wheat gluten were understood, and people started baking, and that became food. And barley was set aside and not really considered a food after that. So the first barley that got here was brought by the Spanish explorers into Mexico, Central America and Mexico, and it migrated up to California. That was a Sixrow. That was a Sixrow that was sourced in Morocco. It was very drought tolerant. That's what was brought over by the Spanish. There was no mention of Tworow at all at that time. And that actually is the California heritage barley. For 300 years, this Sixrow, sourced in Morocco, brought by the Spanish, was the principal barley in California. Now, a little bit later, when the English and Dutch settlers came to the Mid-Atlantic, anywhere from Jamestown to Plymouth Rock, they brought both 2-rows and 6-rows. English 2-rows and Scottish 6-rows, some Dutch barleys. If you recall, in that period, there weren't really many German settlers at that time. It was mostly Dutch and English, and some French further to the north. But in this particular case, in the Mid-Atlantic, the 2-row adaptation was much better in Canada, but the 2-row did not adapt well in the Mid-Atlantic. The
Joe,
Scottish.
do you know if
Yeah.
those were a mixture of both winter and spring barleys, or were they primarily spring, or what?
It'd be hard to tell, John, because right now, if you look at craft brewers in the United States, in my area here in Pennsylvania and Delaware, they're growing winter barleys, and you can grow spring barleys with a winter habit by planting them by variety. So it's hard to tell whether they were. All I could tell you is they were not named. It was not common to name varieties. They were just unnamed land races that came from different regions, and I wouldn't know. I do know now that this climate does support winter barley now. Yeah. So I don't know what happened at that period.
Okay.
I talked to a Penn State agronomist recently about this climate and the fact that barley didn't adapt that well here. And it was interesting. She described what our climate is around here as persistent humidity. So that doesn't sound very comfortable, but it tells you about barley. Barley's a cool season crop. It can tolerate humidity, but not humidity plus heat. And it can tolerate heat, but not heat plus humidity. So it didn't do well. And, so we went through a long period of starting out with 6-rows only. I think probably one of the other thing we always should think about is there were less German settlers then, and there were not lager beers yet either. So, we have always had some 2-row around, but as barley started to expand with the people going west, Buffalo was a malting and milling center, and it was based on the completion of the Erie Canal. Prior to that time, all you could do is get barley close by to your areas of civilization. But now with the Erie Canal, you could take barley from the west, and some 2-row used to come from Canada to the west. So there's always some 2-row around. There's also evidence. There's a good account in the history of the Pabst Brewing Company where they were tested, German brewers there, by the end of the 1800s. They were still trying to find 2-rows that would grow in Wisconsin. And now you could see varieties were being named. And this account says they're looking for a Chevalier type. They were looking, and they tested. They funded all the seed and all the farmers' production of it, of things like Chevalier and Primus and Princess and Svanels. And only Svanels did well. But this all went on between 1905 and 1912. Also, in 1908, the first widespread introduction of a 2-row to the United States happened, and it happened in California. And it was the introduction of the 2-row variety Hanschen, which was a selection. There was no breeding then. It was a selection from Moravian Hanna. And it was made, and it became very successful. And then that became the standard barley in California from then. It's the first successful expansion of 2-row. But, you always wonder if things would have been different, because remember these dates, all the initiatives were shut down by Prohibition. So there's no mention at Pabst that they tried to restart looking for 2-row after Prohibition. And everything had a big setback there. Now, prior to that, there was more. The lager production started at 1840. Adjunct production started about 1870. And I'd point out here that this is another myth about 6-row, that it was in the U.S. and became popular only because of adjunct brewing. That's not true. We brewed for 250 years, ale tradition, before lager and before adjuncts, with only 6-row. So, we came back from Prohibition. I always looked at, there was still virtually no Tworows in the United States, John, and I look to the practical brewer. A lot of people are familiar with the current practical brewer, but I have here on my desk, I have the 1946 first edition practical brewer.
Nice.
And it describes malt. I always like to look in these books because they describe exactly what went on by the knowledge and voice of the time. It's not somebody's modern research and interpretation of what went on. So in this 1946 version, they asked the question, what types of malt are used for brewing in the United States? And they describe the most commonly used malt is made from Six-row Manchuria-type barley grown in the north-central states. Lesser used types are made from Six-row Mediterranean barley, that's still that barley from Morocco, and Tworow types grown in the western states. And they describe it as lesser used. And then in another page, they describe the Tworow varieties, and they describe them as Hanshin and Hana, grown in Oregon, California, Washington, and Montana. And they're grown on limited acreage in the western states for special markets. So we're still a six-row country up until this was written in 46, up through after Prohibition and into the 50s, before brewing really started to expand in the U.S. It's interesting. I don't want to take up all your time with some brewing history, but it's very interesting. I always associated the expansion of Tworow that started into the 50s and 60s, associated with the creation of brewing networks. Up until 1950 or so, all the large brewers operated from a central location and shipped their beer. And the largest breweries in that time, this is from the documents of 1949. The largest brewery in the United States was Schlitz, followed by Anheuser-Busch, followed by Ballantine, Pabst, Falstaff, and Schaefer. And just as relative size, the largest brewery in the United States, Schlitz, wasn't making 5 million barrels. And that's number 6 brewery, Schaefer, was making about 2 million barrels. But all of them were working in a central location. Now, things changed in 1950. The big Midwestern breweries, Schlitz, Pabst, Anheuser-Busch, all did the same thing. They established a brewery in Los Angeles, and they established a brewery in New York and Newark. And I think that's where they got more of their interest. The population was expanding in the West. They wanted to make their beers with a common malt blend, and they were introduced to a lot more Tworow in the West. And they didn't want the difference in their beer made with Tworow in the West and Six-row in the Midwest. And they started to incorporate a common blend across the country. And Tworow started to expand then. Some Tworow usage. I know this is supported by, I worked for Anheuser-Busch, and in the Anheuser-Busch archives, the first Tworow that was in an Anheuser-Busch malt blend was 1950. So that's why I'm thinking this was going. So, then we have to go into this really important step of what this podcast is about, and that's the start of brewing breeding new Tworow varieties. Prior to this, during the 50s, more Tworows were brought from Europe. Malts like Ferlbecks and Betz's and Purelin became common. And in 1972, just prior to the breeding introduction, and it would have been Clogus was the first one, I think we were at about 15% Tworow usage in the United States, and Hanshin and Purelin and Betz's were dominant. They were all originally sourced in Europe and were in U.S. agriculture. Now, crossing of barley started a little sooner than this. We just didn't have a need for it in the United States. The actual technology of crossing for crop improvement started in the UK in about 1880 or 1890. And then in the US, in North America, six-row breeding started about the 20s. But the very first Tworow introduction in the United States that was expanded and doing well was Clogus, and was introduced in 1972 from the USDA in Aberdeen. And that was rapidly followed by Harrington in 1981, and then a gap till Metcalf introduced and Cope in 1997, and Copeland in 1999. And now after Clogus was introduced out of Idaho, those next introductions were all from Canada. And then Hockett, which came from Montana State in 2008. And this is the sequence of the ones that have become dominant now. Now, I have to mention that these are the dominant, easily obtainable commercial varieties. There's a lot of other varieties. Anheuser-Busch and Molson Coors run very robust breeding programs, and they breed barleys for their own interest. And you'll see plenty on the crop reports of varieties like Voyager and Conrad and Merit and Moravian. And BC 100, which is a Coors variety that is a Moravian type, but it was named for Bill Coors' centennial birthday. They breed these varieties for their interest. So there's a lot of Tworow that's used there that comes out of their breeding program. And I would say if you look at the parentage of Clogus and Harrington, the way breeding works, there was lots of Betzes in the parentage of those two. But that seemed to be those traits were lost after Harrington. We seem to have left the European traits behind. And this is important because while we were doing this, the European concepts of barley did not change at all. So today, outside of the AB and Molson, Copeland and Metcalf and Hockett dominate today in this. And we need to talk about exactly how did the breeding of these change. I want to mention one other thing, though, and this is not talked about very much. Beyond the agronomic improvement of these new introductions in the malting industry ended 3-day steeping and ended 5-day germination. The European varieties were not easy to malt, and malt plants had to be built with enough equipment to steep for 3 days and germinate for 5 days. It isn't talked about much, but this really changed the malting industry to their benefit to have less equipment and easier construction for a more streamlined process, because malt plants built after the middle 80s into the 90s, they're built just for 2-day steeping and 4-day germination.
So was the primary driver for breeding those varieties, like you said, the changes to the malting process, or was it primarily for agronomics?
It was always agronomics. That was a benefit that was gained and known after the fact.
So more of a side effect, okay.
Yes, it is. Although I would tell you, when we talk about breeding guidelines and approval processes, the AMBA, because it's a combination of maltsters and brewers, the AMBA approval or the AMBA guidelines always say that the new variety must malt in 4 days, must malt in 4 days germination. So that's actually a standard for acceptance. And that was that's the maltster's input into it. You know, don't get me a variety that the brewers like that malts in 6 days.
Right.
But primarily, and I have a few notes on who gained and who lost in this process. But it's always the farmer. I mean, most of this funding is done although AMBA supports it, most of it's done at the fundamental level in the state land grant universities, and their whole purpose is to support agriculture. And the first priority is always agricultural improvement, crop improvement, and then we as maltsters and brewers get to look at this change as we screen the varieties later. We shouldn't have any misconception that we participate in the breeding process. We participate only we get to screen the results of the agronomic improvement to see its suitability for malting and brewing later.
Yeah, we just had Pat Hayes on the show a few weeks back, and that's a great episode for anybody who wants to really learn more about that breeding process.
Oh, great.
Stay tuned for part 2, where Joe explains how North American Tworow changed, why it happened, and who benefited from that evolution.